Hello, welcome to the Thrombosis UK short video on coping with panic. My name is Paul Bennett, and as you can see, I'm recording this in my garden in sunny South Wales. You may wonder why Thrombosis UK actually has a video on coping with panic attacks. And part of the reason for that is that the research that we've done interviewing and asking questionnaires of people shows that panic attacks are relatively common among people that have had a thrombosis and in particular a pulmonary embolism, and for good and understandable reasons. So what I want to do today is to talk you through a little bit about what a panic attack is, and why people that have had a thrombosis may be particularly prone to them, and some first aid strategies you can use to help you cope with them. So what I'm going to do now is to bring up a PowerPoint that I've already prepared, and I'm going to talk you through it. So just bear with me while the screen goes a little bit funny and I shrink down. I don't like being shrunk. I've got an ego, so I want to be big. So I'm going to expand myself up. Here we are. So the experience of panic is so common and recognized by people that have had a thrombosis that we've now called it the post-thrombotic panic syndrome. And to be fair, this isn't our own idea, actually. This was taken from an interview that we had where somebody that had had a pulmonary embolism actually described and called it this. So what does panic involve? Well, the panic that people experience that have had a thrombosis is no different to typical panic. And you can think of it as having three elements. The first and probably the most important is what is called hyperventilation, and that is rapid, shallow breathing. And that can trigger a whole series of physiological experiences. What it does is that if you breathe shallowly, what you strangely enough do is blow off carbon dioxide, so the body doesn't take in carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is what you need to actually breathe properly. It triggers the breathing response. So if you're breathing rapidly, you're actually not getting enough carbon dioxide into the lungs and then into the blood to trigger a proper breathing response. And in fact, ironically, you get too much oxygen going around in the lungs and the blood, and that itself can trigger a whole series of symptoms, including tingling, lightheadedness, and so forth. So the breathing isn't just a symptom, it's actually a cause of a lot of the experiences that people have if they're having a panic. Along with that are the emotional experience, the thoughts, those feelings of panic. And again, adding to that physiological process, there is the body moving into overdrive, the fight or flight response. The adrenaline kicks in and people become even more wound up, anxious, and so forth. So there are a whole series of things that are happening that are primarily physiological and that result in feelings of very high levels of anxiety and scariness. So what can trigger this process? Well, there are two key indicators that from our discussions that we've had with people that can trigger them. Perhaps the least important, but still nevertheless an important issue, is when people experience reminders or memories of the thrombosis. It may be reflecting back, it may even be things that people were told after they'd had the thrombosis. You know, a few people have said they've been told, "You're lucky, you could have died," and felt very anxious as a result of that. And thinking about that can trigger the panic feelings. But even more important probably are sensations that match the original symptoms that people experienced, particularly where they involve shortness of breath. So if I walk up a flight of steps and get slightly short of breath, which I do, my immediate response is probably along the lines of, oh, I need to get fitter, I'm too fat, blah, blah, blah. But if you previously experienced those sensations as part of a pulmonary embolism or a similar health problem, the thoughts you may have may be much more focused. Am I having another thrombosis? Am I having another pulmonary embolism? And those are anxiety-provoking thoughts. And they can be the beginning of the process of panic. So if I go to the next slide, which is slightly full and lots of things there, it can lead to a whole series of outcomes that I'll now talk you through. So if you think about it, the shortness of breath, the experience of catching your breath can be considered in this little vicious cycle of panic diagram I've got to the left here as a trigger event. That trigger event may be a thought, but it can often be a sort of feeling of being short of breath. The tricky bit is that then leads to the perceptions in the jargon here of danger. Oh, am I having another pulmonary embolism? Am I going to run into physical problems here? And although at a rational level, you may well be able to say, no, 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 these are not symptoms. These are sensations I've had many times before. Because these thoughts arrive rapidly, spontaneously, and without conscious thought, that very nature grabs your attention and becomes a focus. What that then does, if we move on, is move to these fight or flight symptoms. And part of that is you begin to activate the body. You begin to breathe more rapidly as part of that process. You may become physically tense. You may, your heart rate may increase, and so forth. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. That in itself isn't dangerous. But if you're already focusing on some of the problems that you're having internally, some of these sensations, the danger is that you begin to think, oh my God, yes, I really am having a problem now. Look, my heart's racing, my breathing's getting shorter. And you move into what is called, in the jargon, catastrophic misinterpretations. You begin to misinterpret that normal physiological arousal that is the response to feeling anxious or perceptions of danger. You begin to focus on that, and it justifies some of the anxiety you're having. Oh yeah, I really am beginning to get short of breath. I really am beginning to have problems, which then focuses you down, your attention more and more onto those symptoms. You feel more and more frightened because your initial concerns are justified, and you move into this circle of panic, as it's called. You begin to breathe more rapidly, which to some extent proves your anxious thoughts are correct, and in the end you have a full-blown panic. Hyperventilation, feeling sick, feeling anxious, feeling wobbly. Eventually in time that will recede, but it's a very unpleasant experience while you're having it. And it may lead, if we go along this little loop here, to avoidance and safety behaviors. You avoid going into situations where you get those sensations. So it may be, for example, you stop exerting yourself, pushing yourself physically because you're frightened it's going to trigger the whole thing, which may reduce fitness and become problematic. So that's the vicious cycle of panic, from that trigger, perception of threat, fight or flight, and then this cycle where this becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of hyperventilation, scary physical sensations taken as evidence of real physical problems, where in fact they're just part of that process. And if you go to the other side, this much more colorful sort of process, it essentially says the same. There's that, what it argues in this little flow chart here is that people, because they may have had these experiences before, are now looking for them. So when they go up a flight of stairs and begin to get short of breath, they're already focusing on their breathing. Am I going to have it again? If they do, then they begin to focus and they move into that cycle They become aware of the symptoms, they try and control them, but fail, and eventually it leads to a panic attack. Now, the good thing about all this process, although it may be slightly complex, is that it does give some very simple strategies to help prevent or combat a panic if it occurs. So the first thing to do is to be just aware of risky situations where you're likely to experience what I've called ambivalent sensations. Be ready to not be focused and immediately think, oh my God, these are a sign of problems. It's, you know, if you know that you've had these sensations before and that they were not the precursor to a pulmonary embolism or some other sort of catastrophic health consequence, then you're more able to realize and reassure yourself at that point that these sensations are normal, these sensations are not catastrophic, they're not part of a pulmonary embolism, and so forth. The next part of the process is simply this: is to not assume that any catastrophic thoughts you have are necessarily true. The likelihood is they're not true, but because you've experienced them before, because, as I said earlier, they become automatic and unbidden, there is that ring of truth about them, but they may not be. So part of what you can begin to do is to remind yourself, is to talk yourself down. I've had these sensations before. They weren't a sign of that I was having another pulmonary embolism. Why should they this time? Just try not to panic. Because breathing is the driver of the panic process, some very simple breathing exercises can be very helpful. And one of my colleagues came up with a very simple strategy of what she called counting the square. And that involves learning to slow the breathing down, to manage the breathing using a sort of count around a square. So as you go along the top, you count to 4 and you breathe in 1, 2, 3, 4. Down the side, you hold your breath 2, 3, 4. Then along the bottom, you breathe out 2, 3, 4. And then you can hold that breath out 2, 3, 4, and then start breathing in, so that you have a 4 times 4 times 4 times 4 count in which you're breathing, holding, breathing, holding. It's very simple, but very effective. If things are getting really, really bad and you are really panicking, then one of the things that can be done is, in the classic, what's called the brown paper bag. If you breathe into a paper bag, not a flimsy one that's going to breathe in and out and cause you trouble, but essentially if you go back to thinking about what I was talking before, you're breathing off carbon dioxide, and that breathing off the carbon dioxide stops your breathing process occurring naturally. So what you need to do is to breathe that carbon dioxide back in. So if you can put a bag or something across your mouth so that as you breathe in, even if it is rapid and slightly out of control, what you're doing is breathing carbon dioxide in. Eventually that will trigger the normal breathing response and help you manage the panic. What you can also do is do a more general relaxation, relaxing the muscles throughout the body. If you think about the process again, if you're moving into this fight-flight process, then one way of managing that is to try and reduce that entire process that's going on through your body through relaxation. And relaxation doesn't come naturally, it's something that you can learn. And if you look on the website, there is a guided relaxation and internet instructions on how to reduce the tension, how to learn relaxation. It does take some practice, but it's something that can be very useful if you use it at the time of panic. So they're the key things, really. Be ready. Don't assume that the symptoms that you're having are necessarily a sign of problems. Use the deep breathing, use the relaxation, talk yourself down. Remember to use the relaxation. Remember to do the deep breathing. And let's face it, if all else fails, if that doesn't work, then call for help. But don't assume that because those sensations arise, that they necessarily imply that they're having any further health problems. The likelihood is you're not, but you can never discount it. But first aid is to use these sorts of processes. And if you do those, then they should help you manage the panic relatively simply. But although panic is quite a scary experience, some of these very simple strategies can be very effective in helping you do that. And we have some leaflets, if you like, that you can download from the Thrombosis UK website. Here's an image of one of them with a link. There are others as well that you can download and read at your leisure. Well, that's it. That's the end of the very brief video. I hope you find it useful. Hope you found it useful. And if necessary, you find the strategies that we've talked through helpful. But for now, I'm going to bid you a goodbye and look after yourself at this time of COVID and all the other challenges that we're facing that can only add to some of the anxiety that we all experience. So thank you and goodbye.